Thank you, Pam, and thank you, everybody. So I'm guessing a few of us have already done these GoToMeeting Zoom things now, but maybe just to set a couple of logistical things out here before we get rolling. So probably not unlike what we're generally dealing with when we're in a meeting. But if anybody feels like, as either I'm rolling along or anybody else is, Dan will be presenting in a moment. But if as Dan's rolling along, if anybody feels as though they've got a question or comment they want to make, either just raise your hand, or I think there is a chat feature. And if you just put a little question in, or just a note to Pam, she'll call our attention to it in case we're missing the fact. I don't see everybody, so if somebody who I'm not seeing raises their hand, once again, Pam, if you can kind of keep an eye out for that, that'd be great, because as difficult as it might be, we still want to make it as interactive as possible.
Yep,
So,
I have the chat feature open. So if anybody chats that they have a question, or they want to share something, or they want to answer a question, then they can raise their hand.
Yeah, that's great. And then the protocol for voting is a roll call. So as we vote on minutes, or if we vote to adjourn, we'll do a roll call and just poll everybody and make sure that we've gotten everybody's vote in. So with that, I think that was all I had in terms of the logistics. If we move on to agenda, the first item on the agenda is the approval of the minutes from our last meeting on March 4th. So I believe everybody has those minutes, and maybe I'll just ask if anybody has any questions. And I have one minor change to it, but maybe we'll just open it up to the team first. Okay. So it seems like there are no.
We'd have to ask everybody. Nobody has any notes that they're writing to me about any questions. So. Yeah.
So, okay. So maybe with that, I have one change, and that is under project status update, the paragraph that starts with co-chair Scrow. It reads, co-chair Scrow asked for a vote to grant permission for the architectural team to present our project to the appropriate state agencies. I would just like to include it after state agencies before the period for approval. Unless anybody has any question about that, but I think my recollection, and certainly the intent, was we were sending the team off to seek approval from DEEP, following our last presentation from the team on the 4th. So I would say, if there's no questions about that, I would ask for a motion to approve the minutes from March 4th.
This is Krista, so moved.
Thank you, Krista. And I believe Tom, can I ask for a second, please? I see Tom. Thank you very much. Yeah. And then all those in favor, starting with myself. So I approve. And then Frank. Great. Thank you, Martha.
You have to unmute yourself when you answer.
I approve.
Yeah. Frank, can we just go back to you so everybody could hear you approve? Yes. Yeah, great. Thank you. Randy?
I approve.
Great. Cheryl, you were not with us at that meeting. I believe you can actually approve, since you're at this point, as amended, by the way. I apologize, but asking everybody to approve as amended. Cheryl, any comment? Would you like to abstain, or are you approving?
Cheryl, you have to unmute yourself.
Or just raise your hand if you approve. Nod your head if you approve, Cheryl.
Okay, there I am. Okay, yes, I approve. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Cheryl. Okay, so with that, the minutes are approved as amended. Oh, sorry, Tom.
I approve.
Well, you second. Yeah, and you had seconded.
Oh, that's right. Sorry.
Yeah. So with that, the minutes are approved, and we'll move on to the next item on our agenda.
How about with Krista? Did you get Krista's approval? Krista?
Yeah.
Thank you. I moved the motion, so that I do approve. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, by definition. So, okay, so moving on to our next item, which is a general update. I've got a couple of items, and then I'd like to turn the floor over to Dan, but So before I do that, as I mentioned, as we just kind of indicated, our last meeting was on the 4th of March. And since that time, there are a couple of important correspondence that we received. The first I'll talk about is from Jamie. And Jamie sent a correspondence to Lori and myself on the 15th, which was forwarded along to the committee. And essentially, I'll just paraphrase it without reading it all. And I believe it's posted, but it should be posted if it's not on the website. Essentially, what Jamie was asking us, or making a recommendation for, would be to put the project on hold. Recognizing the extraordinary circumstances of this the COVID pandemic, and kind of the uncertainty associated with the impact of the economy. And Jamie kind of explicitly suggested putting the project on hold for 1 year. So with that, in the note, she was asking that we bring her recommendation or suggestion to the commission. With that, I believe it was the same evening, the 15th. I may have that wrong, but we had certainly at our first commission meeting after receiving this letter. I brought this to the attention of the commission. I indicated my support for Jamie's recommendation. I asked if the commission had any further comments or wanted to weigh in on suggesting otherwise, and essentially there was no further comment on it. There was some general comment, but I think everybody acknowledged and accepted Jamie's recommendation. So that was on the 15th. We had this meeting scheduled at that point. We had previously canceled 2 prior meetings that intervened between the meeting on the 4th and now. There were some updates that I shared with the committee pertaining to the work that the design team was doing with DEEP, and Dan will get into that in a moment. And it did seem like it made sense to keep this meeting on the calendar as we're proceeding with now, as a final meeting as we go into this this pause phase. So I don't have anything further on that for the moment, and I'll just ask if anybody has any questions at the moment or would like to just kind of share any other thoughts or comments on Jamie's note.
I unmuted. Oh no.
No, you're not.
Trying.
Can you guys hear Brian?
Yes, you can hear Brian.
Hi, everybody.
Oh, hi, Brian. Welcome.
Hello, Brian.
Thank you.
Okay.
And hello, everybody.
So, yeah. So maybe I'll just continue for one brief second then before we move on to the next item, and that is, so we had Jamie's recommendation. That kind of was happening in parallel with the work that the committee had voted on, which we just talked about at our March 4th meeting, which was to authorize the design team to proceed with DEEP, with the approvals to DEEP. So through Pam, I reached out to Jamie and just simply explained that we had that item underway, shared with Jamie through Pam that I felt as though that was kind of one remaining item that, in my opinion, would be beneficial to nail down before we put the project on hold. It was a significant amount of work that went into preparing for that. In fact, we had been, through Dan and team, kind of into DEEP and trying to get on DEEP's radar for probably 6 weeks, if not a little longer, kind of at the midst of the kind of the early stages of the coronavirus issue. And finally, back a couple of weeks ago, we got an indication from DEEP that they were willing to take up the item, confer on it internally, and get back to us. So having gone through the process of trying to get into them and waiting for their response, we did get a response. They did meet, and they gave us an indication, and I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves here, but we received an indication that they, although it wasn't the formal application that had been presented, it was an indication that they were inclined to approve our plan and our request. So with that as the
But
context in the back, I'm sorry, go ahead, Martha.
I just, are they approving the entire concept, or were they asked to approve raising the parking lot up to 30 inches?
Dan will get into in a moment, but it's raising the
Okay.
parking lot. It is
Okay.
raising the parking lot, though. Yeah.
I just wanted to clarify.
Yeah. So with that, once again, just kind of setting the stage for my dialogue with Jamie, kind of the interaction with Jamie through Pam, just seemed like it made sense for us to proceed as a committee and kind of button that down, especially given that we were, in light of the fact that we'd gotten this kind of indication from Deep. So that's where we are. Dan will give us an update on that. And then certainly, we'll open the floor to any question and answer as we proceed with that. So that's the interaction with Jamie. My sense of this, unless somebody has a different perspective on it, is the way I see this playing out is this will be our last meeting. Dan will proceed with the work that we're doing with Deep to get to some conclusion with that. Dan will explain the implications of that. Depending on how long that takes to unfold, I would anticipate we'll provide the committee with updates, email updates, along the way here until we get to some closure one way or the other. That will be the last remaining piece of business that we have through the committee. And once again, Dan will explain the implications associated with what that means to us. And that will be it. And, should this kind of be restarted at some point along the way, at least that will be one piece that will have been done and buttoned down. So that's my interaction with Jamie in response to her letter and in response to the remaining item that the committee is working on. So that's that item. The other item that came up in the intervening period since our last meeting was the response and the note that we'd gotten from Chief Anderson in response to the Marine Division's, the dialogue with the Marine Division and the work that they were doing to kind of better understand what their requirements might be if we were to proceed with them. That letter's been received, it's been distributed. I think to just simply paraphrase it, I think Chief Anderson goes on in the letter to, I think, make a case for why it would be beneficial and why there's a desire to kind of explore a facility that goes beyond what currently exists either in the concession building or in the boat club. But it also goes on to very explicitly stress that, the police are not suggesting that they would be the reason for, or the central kind of reason for building something, or, so I think the point here is if something were to happen, something were to get built, they'd like to be consulted and brought into the picture and kind of explore the possibility of doing something. But I think they're awaiting anything further. So I think the only thing on this item is, and it has nothing to do with the committee at this stage, would be, I think the commission will have to determine, the Parks and Recs Commission has to determine, what steps it might want to take in terms of following up with Chief Anderson and the Marine Division. And depending on how that goes, ultimately, I think it's anticipated that would result in some feedback that would go back to the Board of Selectmen. And should the Board of Selectmen choose and the commission choose, I guess, that would get reworked into, or deem it appropriate, that would get reworked into a revision of the charge that this committee had and any future committee would have. That would kind of empower the committee or a building committee following on this one to engage in a discussion with the Marine Division. So anyway, long-winded, I realize, kind of explanation of what's going on with that, but I think it's, it is what it is. So any questions or comments or concerns around that item?
I just want to say I appreciated Chief Anderson's message. I thought it was gracious and well worded. It just very, very helpful to us, I think, going forward.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And I think since Chief Anderson is engaged in his role, as kind of, moving into the role of chief, to your point, Frank, I think, the dialogue has been, it's been fulsome and direct. And I think, we've kind of, I've appreciated that as well, along with Chief Anderson making his folks available to us as well. So I appreciate that. And I also appreciate the work that the Police Commission has done in kind of taking this and kind of exploring it more deeply before, kind of moving it on. So in any case, that is that. So with that, I think my sense is we are now at the point where I would like to turn it over to Dan, for Dan to give us an update on where we stand with DEEP and the application process. Dan, what you see is the kind of, the ongoing steps at this point to bring it over the goal line. And then, we'll open it up for the committee to ask you any questions as well and for clarifications. That packet that was transmitted onto DEEP has been circulated with the committee as well, Dan, so folks have that. And so with that, Pam, you can put me on mute, and Dan, we can turn it over to you.
Great, thanks. Pam, can you give me control of the screen? Is that possible?
Let's see. I'm not certain I know how to do that. Let's see if I hit this. Do you have any guidance for me, Dan?
I think if you look, there's the icon for.
Got it.
Yep. Working? No.
No, it actually, let me try it again. Can you see it now?
No, my icon is grayed back.
Yes.
For some reason.
There it is there.
Okay.
There it is.
So that is your screen. I think you can elect me to have control of your screen.
You may try clicking on Dan's name.
And right mouse click.
Uh-oh. I almost got rid of the whole meeting. Let's see.
Pam, or you can pull up the PowerPoint or the PDF, and I can just run through and tell you when to switch.
Yeah, I'm pretty new to this go-to meeting too. So, oops, I keep losing the screen actually now. So view everyone. I gotta try to get it. I have to get back out of this screen where it's sharing my screen.
Oh.
So I don't see it now. Yeah, my screen's completely like, oh, wait, here it is. If I stop sharing it, okay, I'm back to normal now.
Okay.
I'm not certain.
Can you pull up the PDF on your computer and then just share your screen?
Sure.
And then I can just tell you to pass through.
Yeah, but are you gonna email it to me? Is that what you're doing?
Oh, I can if you want. Yeah, I do
But
that.
it wouldn't be to my town one because I'm not on the town. I'll text you my.
Okay.
I have a question, and I don't know that this works, but on the camera icon, if you touch it, it's view webcams, all talking or none. Maybe if you hit talking and Dan is doing the talking, maybe his screen comes up. I don't know. Because
Well,
I hit talking.
I definitely have a shared screen here. That it seems right, but for some reason he can't take control of it. It's coming in control line. So let's just, I'll text him my.
So while Pam's doing that, as Mike mentioned, the schedule that we got the letter from Jamie, and we were in the process of pulling our package together and corresponding with DEEP. Around the 27th, we put together the package and submitted to DEEP. They got back to us with a couple small questions just to inquire about some of detail or here or there, very minor, before they elected to bring it to the greater board, which was their committee was made up of staff plus assistant director and the director, which was on I believe the meeting was officially on the 23rd of April. They came back on the 27th, which I think I shared information with Mike and he circled around. On 27th, they agreed with our approach to the parking lot. So I was going to run through that series of PDFs that I submitted to DEEP and the approach that we had that would be part of our package for the COP here in the next couple of weeks. Pam, did you text me? Sorry.
Yes, I did.
Okay. Okay. Hold on a second. All right, you should get it right now. So we heard back on the 27th that they would be in favor of our approach to the parking lot. The package that was sent around was more or less a culmination of many of our presentations leading up to preparing that package. So I thought I'd run through what that approach was. A little about what at the pre-scoping meeting that we had, which is now, I think, it might have been in December or possibly November at this point, and when we met with staff at DEEP, the components that we talked about with them at that time for what the COP would include, the first item was there was an encroachment into the coastal jurisdiction limit for the bathhouse. That was the first item that was discussed that would need approval. The second are the improvements to the parking lot, which has been a lot of our focus to date. The second is the Darien Boat Club structure actually is, quote, non-compliant with current regulations. So we would have more of a formality to get that approved within the COP, that structure, which is quasi-grandfathered in its location, to be on record and approved by DEEP in their processes. The next would be the boat ramp would be included in that COP package to have that improved and replaced in kind. The wetland replacement or wetland restoration component would be the next item in the COP, which we've been talking about so far, but it would be formally submitted to them. And then finally, the harbor dredging, which has been a thought out there that we had included in the component of the project. We haven't discussed much about it. More or less, it's been dredged in the past, so we have to reapply to have the harbor dredged in the same location to the approved depth of DEEP. So that would be the last component of that COP package once we get around to actually making that formal submission. So a lot of those items we have on hand that is the background documents that we need to prepare and submit. But a lot of our focus has been on the parking lot, which is actually the design component that needs to happen. Tom, did you have a question? No.
Just coming off of mute. Yes. The dredging of the waterways around the Darien Boat Club, that's a maintenance dredge, right?
Correct. Yes.
Okay. Just trying to make sure everybody understands it's not a much easier permit to get than it is a non-maintenance dredge.
And more or less, long story short, DEEP would allow for maintenance activities to proceed to dredge basically to the pre-approved depth. So anything that has filled in since the last dredging operation, which now has been many years ago, would be allowed or approved to dredge to that same depth, but not any deeper. So this action is, yes, a maintenance activity on the COP, and we're not requesting for anything additional than what has been approved in the past.
May I ask a question here, or do you want the questions at the end, Mike?
No, I think you can feel free to ask questions.
Okay, just on the topic of the harbor dredging, I'm sorry, this is Krista. Just to clarify, can you, Dan, how that fits into the components of our charge?
Yeah, I'm trying to think. I think we have the priorities there on the screen.
Please
Don't
don't,
recall-
in no way, this is not a comment on the dredging process per se. I just wanted to understand it in context of our charge.
Sure. I don't have memorized your charter or your charge as a committee. I believe that the general scheme of it is that I believe where it started was where we know that the pitch of the boat ramp is not correct, it needs to be rectified or remediated. As a result, we know that there is a high spot just beyond the boat ramp itself. So that is basically trickle effect back through the harbor that if you were to try and launch around a low tide or just higher than low tide, you basically hit a sandbar, and that sediment prohibits the use of the boat ramp more or less. So that more or less, that functioning is part of the operation of the boat ramp. I don't know if Tom or Mike can chime in on any other of the details of where that has originated from.
Okay, I just want to clarify, yes, and then I would like to hear from Tom. I certainly would agree that this would fall under the charge then of reconstruct boat ramp or have a functional boat ramp. I just want to understand our role versus what the Park and Rec Commission or department should be handling under operating. But Tom, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
The quick answer is the current boat ramp, the way it was designed, doesn't work. And they didn't dredge the harbor when they put this in, that particular area of the harbor. So as Rob was pointing out, you really can't launch boats very efficiently unless it's almost the 2 hours plus or minus high tide. The dredging that we've always talked about here is a maintenance dredge at the end of the boat ramp. It has no further implications of going up the channel or around the channel, around the boat club out to Long Island Sound. It's just maintaining and fixing the depth of the water so boats of sizes that are using the ramp can use the ramp.
So Krista, maybe another way to just kind of, or maybe if I could just add on to what Tom and Dan have said, is you could simply look at it as under the charge, kind of fixing the boat ramp, if I could simplify it in that way. What we learned as we proceeded into this early on is fixing the boat ramp also includes doing that maintenance dredge. So in other words, we could rebuild a boat ramp, and if I'm understanding correctly, and not do the maintenance dredge, and we will not have fulfilled the charge of fixing the boat ramp.
Fixing the use of the ramp to launch boats. You would have fixed the boat ramp.
Yeah. Well, I mean, to make it usable.
Yes.
Yeah.
No, perfect. I thank you for the clarification and the more detail there. And just to clarify, we are not dredging the entire harbor. Thank you so much, Tom and Mike.
Just for the record, the Darien Boat Club and the Rowton Yacht Club and the town contributed money for the last 2 surveys of the harbor that were done. Off the top of my head, it was, I think, in 2000. We did it in 2018, I think it was, and then like 5 years or 4 years before that, I don't know the time, but during my tenure as harbor master, we've done it twice. And in both instances, the survey came back that the channel goes, basically it's an inverted J from the end of the boat ramp-ish all the way out to the red and green buoys, the Coast Guard buoys in the harbor. The channel has not silted at all. I shouldn't say at all. It hasn't silted enough to have to come in and re-dredge. So the one area that has always needed to be fixed is at the end of the boat ramp, but the main channel is fairly decent for most boats.
Dan, where would you like the screen to be? Do you want me to start from the beginning on this?
Yeah, just
Can
go to
I-
slide
Can I
2.
ask a question on talking about the boat ramp and the dredging?
Yes, please.
All right, Pam, go back to that the screen you just had up with the measurements and everything on it. Site design, I think it was. That's it. So if we, there it is. So I thought at one time we talked about, we're going to dredge in front of the boat ramp, so many feet out, so much depth to go back to the same permit as they had before. And I have it someplace, but I can't find it right now. And at that time, I thought we were also going to dredge over towards the west also, around that corner at the end of, what is that, Tom, Sea Dock over there?
It's CDOC. That we were never talking about that in this committee, Cheryl. That is
Okay.
beyond this. That is beyond the scope of this project.
That's
If
what
the
I
ta-
thought, but I
If
thought
the
we,
town, if
go
the
ahead.
town wants to dredge, that's a whole different story to the complete channel. But that involves two private clubs, or one private semi-club and one private club that are using the channels. And as I said, the survey that we did in 2018 or 19, whatever it was, said that the turns around the corners were acceptable by the marine contractor that did the survey. There was no need to dredge. Could we dredge? Yes, but there was no real need to dredge to make the turns easier.
Are you talking about the main harbor going down?
No, I'm talking about again an inverted J from the
Okay.
end of the boat ramp
Okay.
out to the red and green buoys that are in the main harbor, the Coast Guard buoys. That's what we surveyed.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
And Dan, where do you want me to have the screen?
If you want to just go to one slide above, please. What you're going to see here are basically the slides. Some of them are summary from the last committee meeting we had. But just to reiterate, we basically were framing for deep as to what the current conditions are within the park beach area, what conditions would look like, and how could we rectify or resolve some of these issues that are happening. So if you remember back to a couple months ago now, we framed for them on the low points, highlighting the catch basins, which is 4.2 right in the middle. Surrounding that is a coastal jurisdiction limit, 5.5. That area is actually what they have the most say in, but it's all connected. So we had to, we showed the whole picture for them as to how it all relates, all the way down to the catch basin right at the entrance, which is 4.9. In the road is 5.9. Park Drive is about 6.0. And then everything drains towards the drain outlet at a negative 2.2. Just for reference, the buildings are about 7.92. That's the concession building bathhouse. And also the boat club is about 7.9. So those are high points within the site. Go to the next slide. So framing for them the overall site and elevations, we then highlighted for them the current drainage system that exists within the parking lot. And as everyone knows, the catch basins are all connected within the park area, and then they all are directed towards the existing drain outlet at a negative 2.2. That collects stormwater from the parking lot as well as from Pear Point Road, which has a series of catch basins and underground piping directed to that drain outlet. So knowing that, we wanted to make sure they understood that this system was not just the park itself, but also the roadway adjacent to it. And then we also shared with them what happens. So you can see a description on the left, just that during high tides, we know that there are localized floodings occur just on the frequency that we discussed in last meetings. So beyond the storm events, there is localized floodings in some of these low areas within the parking lot itself. Next slide. This is, again, you've seen all this information already. So this is just showing the frequency at which during the normal tides, when these would happen, how high or how deep those flooding events within the parking area would occur or how frequently they occur. Basically just framing for them as to what it looks like on a normal basis and what it could look like as we progress forward. Next slide.
Has just a little bit of a hesitation, right?
Yeah, it's a little delayed.
Yeah.
You've all seen this. Again, we just want to map for them as to what does it look like with the existing 2020 conditions, knowing that the area around that 4.2 catch basin sees the immediate flooding occurring, and it kind of spreads out. The next slide. So as it's spreading out, we know that as water rises or as more storm events occur, we know that that's basically concentration area then spreads to adjacent areas within the parking lot, and it's beyond that coastal jurisdiction limit of 5.5. Now spreading across the parking lot and potentially into the roadway, but basically it's more flooding is occurring as the water is rising or more water is coming into backwatering or potentially over the shoreline into the parking lot. So then we took that last condition and said if we were to make improvements, which is to adjust the grades within the parking lot, we now have a number of catch basins, more catch basins that will collect water in smaller sub-watershed areas. And we now can direct our stormwater to the same outfall as what's adjacent to the boat ramp. In this condition of today, you would not have that localized flooding. You would not have, there's obviously no color within the parking lot, so that means it's dry. That flooding events would not occur. That 4.2 elevation would be raised to a 6.6 in this condition. It's moved a little bit off of the beach line itself, but it prevents from having that backwater effect due to the elevations of that catch basin versus the adjacent water elevation as it's rising. So that's at 2020, next slide. And then we projected for them as to what that proposed improvements will look like. Even just with a 12-inch seaward level rise, it's basically spot improvements, but more or less it's all high and dry. A little bit of watering happening around some of the catch basins, but more or less it's showing that the elevations of the parking lot are sufficient to not having the water ponding. Next slide. We then shared with them just our research as a team we did for the high tide analyses, getting to some of the earth science discussion about how many tides occur, how often they are, and how it affects tides and basically the water transport happening within the site. Just for some background for them. Next slide. And then we shared with them the analyses on that the beach itself is stable. In our pre-permitting meeting we had with DEEP, they acknowledged that the beach is free stable. We wanted to show to them that we weren't just taking their word for it. We were really listening and looking at what makes it stable. And this is part of a conversation we had as a committee a couple months ago. Next slide. So looking at the alignment and the positioning of the beach itself, relating that to our analysis of wind and wave climatology, just on a frequency of events, basically proving or showing that the beach is stable within its current conditions, leading to any improvements we're doing are sustainable and will be lasting for years to come. Next slide. Again, showing the angle at which the beach faces, the side exposure just on that degrees and the frequency of the winds number of events or speeds that occur within that zone that we're dealing with on the beach. Just supports of the stability of the overall beach itself. Next slide. Again, this is some discussion we had the last meeting just on the accretion, erosion conditions within the beach itself or within the town, that there hasn't been movement really happening within this part of the greater coastline of the state. Next slide. And then we support it with a number of aerials just to that we found that support this analysis to date back to 1934. Next slide. So all this is basically everything we shared with you all to date at the last meetings. Pam, if you want to open the other PDF that I sent to you, basically it's another Zoom, I think. So our result, they reviewed. We didn't really have, all they requested from us is to show what the cross section looks like that goes from Pear Tree Point Road through the parking lot to the beach, which is a pretty minor request in my mind to share with them. But in order to really propose these improvements with the COP application, we would need to get through preliminary design phase to, it's Pam, it's probably okay. It's the same, I think it's just an enlargement of the, one of the slides that I had there.
I have it. I'm just getting it right now.
Okay. So more or less, we'd be looking to further design to preliminary phase. What that does is it gives us enough reassurance on the concepts we provide so far, have enough detailing of the greater design. This graphic here is showing you once enlarged basically is a little more advanced than what you've seen last time, but we basically took the overall parking lot, broke out some sub-watershed areas, some slopes, are really detailing out a little bit of how the water would flow within the parking area, how it relates to the greater park itself, or parking lot itself. So we take this a little further in advance with some details on how the transition happens between the beach and the parking lot. What does that curb look like? What are grades? Make sure it's stable from a design standpoint, and just make sure that functions. So our package that goes deep is designed appropriately, and that we don't want to have any changes post COP approval. So we would have that accepted to them, and from there on, the next steps after COP approval would just be final design details that enable construction documents to be produced for future construction. So really taking design a little further than what you see here in this graphic, would not really have any of the color on it, just more design details to further design for DEEP's approval.
Hey, Dan, do you want to just talk about kind of how you see the next couple of steps in the application process unfolding, what you might anticipate? And then if we are fortunate to be granted the COP, talk a little bit about the duration of that, like what will be the shelf life of the COP, and maybe, you know, any other information you can give us around that.
So timing wise, if we were to move forward with design, we'd have a couple of weeks, say 4 or 5 weeks, really design, pull a package together, circle back within our internal design team, prepare the application documents, which we were to go through all the 6 components. We have basically described for them our term analyses, our process to date, and coming up with why the CLP application is sufficient enough for the approval, and how we are within the guidelines of the state. So once that gets to them, I believe they have basically a few months, non-pandemic era, to give an approval and our acceptance of our document, or give us a response back at a minimum. So as we have with all of our permits of everywhere working, every agency is a little slower right now to give response, since everyone's working from home more or less. So once it goes in, I would expect just an acknowledgement that they accepted our package. If they have any questions, they'll circle back with us within 30 days, and then give us guidance that they'll be approving that within the next month or so after that, or 2 months after that. Once the COP, if it were to be approved and issued, then you have 2 years to implement those improvements. And most pre-pandemic era, you would have additional 1 year of extension possible after that. Now, knowing that circumstances aren't the same as pre-pandemic era, I don't know if agencies would have a little more leeway, but that's a discussion point if we ran into that challenge, just to frame for them as to what the conditions are. They want to make sure that you're going to implement what you are proposing, or you have to resubmit a new package at whatever date it is to apply for a new SOP and have new review process to occur. So in normal conditions, you would look at a couple months. Here, I think it's advantageous if we are in a pause period that we get the approval we have in hand. We know we have 2 years to get those improvements enacted or implemented with a possible extension. And most cases, if you show that you're making progress in a project and that when your extension expires, they're not usually going to turn you down. They're going to accept that you're going to complete the project and finish what you've proposed and agreed to. So a little reassurance there. If you show progress, they're accepting to those that action.
So potentially, and all this is kind of an unknown until we know that we've gotten a permit, but potentially the shelf life could be longer than 2 years. There's a possibility of that being the case.
Two plus one. So if you have a 2 year period, and then you would then after 2 years or right before the termination period, then you apply for an extension, which is more of the formality, and you would commit that you're going to make those improvements. So you have 3 years more or less. If it were in an abnormal condition, which it could be at that time, then you would basically have to frame for them as to why conditions haven't changed for you, just that there's a delay due to financial or whatever reasons are that we're promising we're going to move forward, but we need a little more time. So that's a conversation to have with staff once the COP is issued at the conclusion of close to 3 years.
Okay. Maybe at this stage, I'd like to open it up, and if any of the members of the committee have any questions for Dan.
Where am I? I do.
Okay, Cheryl.
Hi. In the last slide that you had on, that's the package that you're sending to the DEP, presenting to them. In that package, in that slide, there were different dots on it that I couldn't see. Okay, thank you. So the black dots are drainage, I'm assuming. Are those catch basins that are on there?
Yeah, Pam, if you want to just zoom in on that, for example, that one catch basin that was 4.2 that we raised, just as a quick, you can zoom in on it.
The 4.2 catch basin over by the West Beach, that's the one that's problematic, and that's the one that causes the flooding into the parking lot. But
Yes.
all those little black dots, what are they? Because I can't read it.
So when Pam zooms in, some of them are high points, some of them are low points. So we basically supplement typical contours or spout elevations by showing to them where would water flow and where our catch basins located. So if you look at the one catch basin that's the 4.2, and you see a line, there's a line going to the north, there's a line going to the south, a line going to the east from that one point. Those are
Right.
storm drain lines. So the line that goes to the north, CB, and that's GR equals 6.2. That is a catch basin towards the boat club. And then there's a series of them that heads towards the concession stand as well. All that feeds through that formerly 4.2 catch basin down towards the entrance to the park, and then out to the existing drainage pipe right by the boat ramp. So
Okay.
all the dots are not all additional catch basins. Some are high points, some are low points, some are just annotative notes so that Deep could interpret what our intent was.
Okay. If you go over by the boat club, it looks like you've reconfigured the parking spaces to head in toward, facing in towards the boat ramp.
Yep. Yes.
So you reconfigured that. Are we still minus 31 parking spaces?
I believe we're pretty close to that. In this location, we looked at how the grading would work with the alignment of the parking stalls. I know that there's, it's a little unconventional how it is right now. We circled back with the fuel supplier and the hose length available to get fuel to the boat club. Boat club came back saying that this proposed configuration would be acceptable to them since deliveries occur when most people aren't using those stalls. So this is a more standard or traditional parking configuration for a parking lot with the nodes and parking and having availability to, if you're in the last stall, it can back out into a dead end zone and then depart the parking area.
So where are the 2 handicap spaces that are up there by the boat club? They will still remain in that area?
Yeah. So if you see there's, it's not noted because the plans aren't designed yet, but there's one that has a hatch through it. That would be the walking zone between 2 handicap stalls.
Okay. And then if you can slide it down to the other end of this slide, Pam?
Yep.
And this is, how high are we making this parking lot? Are you applying for, what was it, the 24 inches elevation of the parking lot? And then if we decide to go 12 inches or 18 inches or whatever, we have the ability to do that?
So our correspondence with them so far was we went in with the greatest elevation, which I believe was the 24-inch fill, maybe 30 inches of fill. Let me see.
I think it was, it wasn't 30,
Well.
I think it was 24.
Email mentions 30.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah, but I thought maybe that was like the max, but I didn't think we ever, any of the other plans weren't up to 30. I thought it was like 24.
Yeah, so majority is 24. There is, I think, one spot that's deeper than the rest for a very localized area, but more or less it was the 24-inch fill, which they were accepting too.
Okay, down towards the South Beach, CBGR 65.5 or 6.5, there's like a square around there. And then there's one over by the picnic area. What does that square represent?
So CB refers to catch basin.
Right, but
and
I'm
GR,
talking about that square in there.
Yeah, the square would be a catch basin.
No, the whole square going around the whole thing.
So that's a contour line that's
Okay.
showing, yeah.
Okay.
That's
Okay.
actually the 7.0 contour, because if you look at the catch basin is at 6.5. And if you go diagonal towards the West Beach, you see HP of 7.5. That is showing you it rises there to 7.5. So there's a 7.0 contour that surrounds that catch basin.
Okay, so you are just submitting plans to the DEP for the parking lot and the boat ramp, correct?
What we had talked about in the pre-permit meeting with Deep were the 6 items that I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation.
Okay, all right, I've got those.
Yep. So that's what we have to discuss so far with Deep. It's more or less a conversation conversation for this committee, it's advantageous to include as many items in the COP application as possible, but understanding that the boathouse, or sorry, not the boathouse, the bathhouse has not been settled upon, that may be one item that at this point may be left off of that list until that is formally approved or accepted. But the other items are more or less components of the site. It would be advantageous to have that as a part of this package to get approved by DEEP.
Okay, so the expansion of the beach, 18 inches, 18 feet out, is on this plan also?
Yes. Yep. So if you go back, EOP is edge of pavement. There's a couple dots that go around. That is the new edge of pavement, and you can actually see upper right hand corner of the screen, there's a small square. That's where the existing catch basin is, the problem catch basin, more or less. So you can see how much of that is now returned back as beach.
Okay, I see where you are. Okay.
Yep. Yep.
All right. Thank you.
Sure.
Hey, Dan, can you just say a few words about the effect of this plan on the boat ramp and the work that needs to be done on the boat ramp?
Yeah, Pam, if you want to pan over to the boat ramp itself.
Got it. It's on my screen.
It's coming, just hopefully.
Very delayed.
Oh, there you go. So what this does is that as we are raising the parking lot itself, I mentioned a while back, our control for our grades are the elevation of Pear Tree Point Road. That's a control. We can't really be higher than that, more or less. And then the grades of the beach are a driving factor. The rest is as we work in the grades of the parking lot, as we raise the parking lot, we then give us a greater difference between the bottom of the boat ramp that exists to date and the new top of boat ramp. So what that does is you can see all the lines that basically are running parallel to each other as you run down the boat ramp. Enables those contours to be closer together, which means that that is steeper than if they're further apart. So by raising, we now have a grade. You see the arrow with a 2.1, that's a 2.1 slope at the top of the boat ramp. And then as it progresses down, it's at 13.5% with the arrow. It's showing we have a 13.5% slope going down the boat ramp. So it's actually helping us. If we did not have the raising of the parking lot, that may not be 13.5. It might be less than that, which is less than optimal. Or the other consequences, there may be a shorter boat ramp, which we don't want to do because knowing the length of the boat, the boats themselves, the vehicles, and just the operational needs to launch a boat. So it actually is helping us in terms of getting that elevation difference between the bottom boat ramp and the top of the parking area.
Thank you. And Dan, one other question for me. Just confirm, the plan that we're looking at and what will be submitted to DEEP has been, it's the product of the work that obviously you and Weston and Sampson have done, but also with contributions from Redness and Mead and Race. Is that accurate?
Yeah, so the package that went to DEEP, we actually circled through our whole team, which was Redness and Mead and Race. Neil Houck also contributed comments. So we took all that feedback in. This plan here, we circled through the whole team as well, just to rebound ideas and to get the best of everyone's opinions. And then this is what was submitted to DEEP with everyone's input.
Okay. I'm sorry, I do have one other question on this, and that is, it's kind of like an obvious, maybe it's going to sound like a silly question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. In your experience, when DEEP goes through this plan, what is the level of kind of scrutiny and analysis, and that it's your sense that DEEP will apply to this in terms of the engineering, the science, the stormwater management aspects of it? What does a DEEP COP actually carry with it in terms of the work that they've done to provide their approval?
So with them giving the thumbs up, more or less, of saying we agree with your approach and we would be favorable towards how you're redesign this parking lot, that it more or less is saying we like the direction you're heading. We do want to see some details on how it's actually going to be constructed and built to make sure it complies with our guidelines and our standards, more or less. So they will be looking at more or less with a fine-tooth comb at a preliminary design level. So taking this plan and developing a little further is what they need to actually distribute or to issue a permit for our use. They don't get to the point where, just hypothetically, saying they check the thickness of the concrete of the ramp, or what are the size of the riprap stones you might be proposing. They would more generally want to know that you're going to have a concrete ramp and that you're going to have riprap of a size. So it's enough to issue the permit with the, they're relying on the design professionals that are licensed to design these features within a site that comply with their regulations, more or less.
Yeah, got it. Okay.
And they do request that we have plans signed and sealed. So, we're certifying that what we're putting together for them is acceptable means and methods within our industry.
Understood. Okay. Any questions at this stage for Dan? Any further questions? Great. Dan, with your permission, I'm going to read an excerpt from a draft of a letter that you prepared that may or may not ultimately end up needing to go to DEEP, but it was a bit of a kind of a framing and explanation of what you have here and kind of the work that we've done. So you and I hadn't chatted about me reading this, but I think you're going to be okay since we've distributed this to the committee. So it's just the next excerpt, but I think it's a nice kind of, once again, framing and context for what it's applicable here. So in Dan's letter, once again, the excerpt is, the town of Darien is committed to preserving coastal resource areas in compliance with guidance from the Connecticut Institute of Resilience and Climate Adaptation, also known as CIRCA, as we know. Our analysis of current and projected water elevations due to storm surges, wind and wave climatological conditions, historical shoreline accretion and erosion changes, and sea level rise all indicate that the Pear Tree Beach is subject to flooding and can be preserved for future generations. The most sustainable approach to preserving Pear Tree Beach is to expand the beach areas, regrade and raise the parking area, restore tidal wetlands, and rehabilitate boating access. We believe the Pear Tree Beach Park project is one of the first projects in the state to clearly address changing coastal conditions in an effort to preserve resources in a sustainable manner. The town of Darien is committed to protecting and restoring Connecticut's valuable resources and requests that you consider reviewing our project as a precedent example of sustainable restoration of coastal resource areas. And Dan, I think, I commend you. I think it's wonderfully said, and I think it really captures exactly the heart of what we're trying to do here. So, so well done with that. So if no other questions or comments for Dan, Dan, you can hang in there with us.
I have a question.
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay. Please proceed.
Going back to that 4.9 catch basin that floods the beach. In the last meeting that you had and I can't find it now, but the way in which the water flows into that catch basin, I had always thought it came out from the beach into the catch basin, and then from the harbor end, and then into the catch basin, and then flooded the parking lot. You said that it was coming from a catch basin that was over in the breakwater, in the wall by Pear Tree Point Road. And it was coming in there, then going up Pear Tree Point, and then coming across a pipe under the parking lot, and then coming up through that catch basin. Since we're on hold for this, and we don't know what the next step's going to be, even if we get all this approved, when we can start. Is there, and this is also for Pam, is there any way on that pipe that brings the water in and ends up flooding the parking lot to put a, oh shoot, I just lost that thing. I'm thinking of catch basins. What do you call that thing? That check valve.
Check valve.
Check valve on that thing to stop the water from coming in there and then flooding the parking lot. And how much would a check valve cost to do that now and save the parking lot from flooding for maybe the year? It's probably going to be another year or year and a half before we get the shovel in the ground on any of this, I think. But let's hope it's sooner than later. But I'd like to know if that's possible, Dan, what you think about that.
I know that Pam and Mike got some general costs, if I recall, just to see if that was an interim improvement that could be made while we are going through this design planning process. I believe it was fairly cost prohibitive just because of location. The value of the valve just didn't seem like the best investment at the time. Do either of you recall what that?
Yeah, may I? Let me take a crack at it. So Cheryl, we've learned a lot about that scenario as we've gone through here. So first off, I think one of the things that I would just ask everybody here on the call to keep me honest with this. One of the things we learned is that it contributes to certainly dumping water onto the parking lot, but it doesn't. It's not a cause of the flooding on the parking lot. So you'll see water coming out of that, and we've both witnessed it together. So you might have a high tide condition. On a sunny day, water will come up out of that because the tide is kind of raised high enough where water's backflowing into that storm drain from the inlet by the boat ramp. It'll create some pooling, and then essentially that water drains off as the tide recedes. And that's about the extent. I think what you're seeing there is about, on a sunny day, is about the extent of the contribution of water that's coming up through that. Otherwise, typically when a parking lot is flooded, especially in that area, it's a function of water that's actually breaching the beach and the curb and coming into the parking lot. So it plays a role. It's not a significant role from what I had understood. And the feedback we've gotten from Craig Flaherty, as when he looked at it, is that the benefit of it's certainly something that's doable, but the benefit is something that isn't as dramatic as we might have hoped for. Well, not hoped for, but we kind of understood maybe, or at least I understood when we were originally discussing it. So I don't know if that's, and to Dan's point, we did get some initial estimates based upon the feedback we'd gotten from Craig. I think we didn't proceed with any further estimates, also because we were going down this other road of exploring modifying the parking lot in a more significant way. And if that's the case, that particular check valve solution doesn't factor into the solution that Dan just presented. So if anybody else wants to add any clarity or correct anything that maybe I got wrong there, please feel free.
I also want to add that Ed Gentile has had experience in check valves, and it was his recommendation that it wouldn't be in our best interest to go that route. He felt that it was rather way too costly for the size of that valve, and that it would be better to look into raising of the parking lot rather than the check valve.
Okay, thank you.
But could I just ask, I thought I saw in the plan, I thought I saw something saying backflow preventer or something. Did I? Or am I imagining that?
Yeah, we put in that possibly we could add one, depends on the elevation at which the pipe departs from the catch basin that's right by the entrance to the of the park area. So
Right.
as we further design the catch basins, the structures, and the pipes, we'll see if that's going to be advantageous. In general, as we put plans forward for deep, we can include more and tell them afterwards that there's some things that we chose not to improve, but they could be accepting to base the improvements we're putting in the plan. So we're still in the design process. So it was in there that if we want to get a reaction, if they saw that as an extremely negative component for this type of facility, that they would reflect on then saying everything but this. We didn't get a negatives on anything we put forward, so they're accepting to our overall plan.
Mike, if I could interrupt, I think Krista had a question and got cut off.
Please, Krista.
I think the one question I had just when you began your presentation, you were saying for the COP a couple of weeks for design. Is it much beyond what we're already seeing now? Just to clarify.
If we have not further designed anything beyond what you've seen on the screen, what's been submitted to date to DEEP, so we'd have to further design through preliminary design phase of the project, which is detailing, more grading, really working out the nuts and bolts. That takes a couple weeks, and then it forms a attachment that goes to our package to DEEP for the permit application itself. So we're looking at a couple weeks out still before we would have that application prepared to be submitted to DEEP.
Okay, just to clarify. Thanks so much.
Yep. Yep.
Can I ask Dan a question?
Yeah, please.
Dan, if you had to guess from a financial standpoint, what do you think raising the parking lot would be? How much would that cost? As a
Hey, guys,
SMED.
I'm sorry, Tom. So I'm going to intervene here. And one thing I'm just going to ask here is, and I made this comment at the end of my statement, I'm not at all comfortable, and you guys can overrule me. I'm not at all comfortable at this stage, and this is something that I would suggest I learned my lesson on kind of earlier in the project, presenting any numbers without having those numbers accompanied by the equivalent of the cost per household per year equivalent. So putting a number out there that's just an abstract number, I think it's not productive. It's not helpful, because at the end of the day, when we're putting a number out there, we're putting a number out there that I think is going to be interpreted as the cost to the community, which I'm all for. I just feel as though it's an incomplete picture of the cost to the community. So respectfully, I would just ask that until we have a number, I'd rather not talk about numbers. And when we do have a number, if we ever get to that stage, my ask to the Board of Finance is that they work up, based upon whatever number we have, what the equivalent cost per household per year will be. So folks will actually understand what the price tag is that they would be asked to incur as a function of any improvements we're making. So
I guess I'm gonna say two things, non-costs, but the first is we don't have quantities yet, so we won't know that to do a cut fill analysis on the overall parking, what the fill is, to know what the cost would be. The second is, due to the pandemic conditions, we've seen our last 4 projects they're bidding in the Northeast significantly lower right now due to the market changes that are projected to occur. I mean, almost half of a budget that we propose in a project is coming in on a couple large projects. So the market is changed so fluid right now, it's almost unheard of what contractors are just trying to get their hands on to build a backlog of work for the rest of the year into the early first quarter of next year. So the market is, it's so fluid right now, but it's favorable for clients, municipalities, right in these conditions. I can't say anything beyond that, because it's just we do a lot of projections in our firm just to know what's looking ahead, but The market changed significantly after the end of March.
So Tom, I appreciate you bearing with me on this. Thank you. Thanks,
No
Dan.
problem. I understand completely.
Yeah. Okay. So any other questions for Dan on the plan, the application process, what we can expect? And as I said, a short while ago, what we'll do is we'll keep the committee apprised of any updates as we've been doing since our last meeting, as things roll along, and hopefully we'll achieve the outcome that we're hoping for here in terms of getting a final approval from DEEP. Okay, so with that, Dan, thank you very, very much. Much appreciated. And feel free to kind of hang in there through the end of the call, or you can hop off if you'd like. But thank you very, very much, and great job.
Thank you.
Okay, so with that, I think we'll move on to our next item on the agenda, which is the public comment section. And I think, Ben, you can correct me here, but I believe the way this is worked under this new kind of virtual meeting framework is we request that folks who would like to comment publicly submit those comments in writing on the morning of the meeting, no later than the morning of the meeting. And so, with that, Pam, have we received any? And if so, would you like to just kind of work us through those and read us through those, please?
Yes, we only have one, and it's from H.P. Boyle on 150 Goodwives River Road. He writes, forgive my confusion over the Parks and Rec Director's report of April 15, 2020, stating that the development of Pear Tree Point Park is on hold until further notice. While at the same time, there's a public meeting notice of the Pear Tree Point Building Committee on May 6th. If there is a meeting to be held, below are my public comments submitted as directed per the meeting agenda posted on the town website. I continue to object to the development of Pear Tree Point Beach beyond the renovation option as fiscally irresponsible and contrary to the will of the town residents. Spending over $2.5 million for a building with commercial kitchen design to generate rental income is inconsistent with the values of the majority of Darien. See Town Survey, Grassroots Petition, Darien Times Survey. I continue to object to the Parks and Rec insistence on the commercial kitchen, particularly when no study has been done regarding the demand for a concession at the park. If we build it, they will come is an irresponsible way to run a town. I continue to object to the portrayal of the proposed project model in Town Hall and on the FAQs solely at low tide rather than high tide as deliberately misleading of just how close to the water's edge this project is. To be a true representation, a rendition should also be offered showing the development at flood tide. I continue to object to the plan of development being sold to the town as incomplete. In particular, it is deceptive not to show a rendition with garbage and fry oil storage, nor a nighttime rendition with proposed lighting. The costs of these have not been included in the project cost estimates. I continue to object to raising the parking lot as a waste of town resources and as unnecessary. There is no need for the park to be accessible on days when Mother Nature dictates otherwise. I continue to object to the lack of completeness in determining ongoing maintenance costs of the proposed development as deliberately misleading. I continue to object to proceeding with the development without a traffic study that incorporates the access route to the park. Pear Tree Road is narrow, winding with blind curves and used by throngs of walkers and cyclists in fine weather. It is irresponsible to develop a park in a way that will make the road access more dangerous for the entire community. Please don't dismiss the comment as you did all the facts about site flooding. I continue to object to the misleading statement in the PTP BBC FAQ stating that weed beach rentals generate a net profit to that town as deliberately misleading and contrary to generally accepted accounting principles, GAAP. The numbers do not include capital costs and therefore cannot be called net profits. Parks and Rec should not employ fraudulent accounting to justify its development ambitions. I continue to object to the FAQ 26 answer on the check valve as a source of flooding as deliberately misleading, contrary to fact, and something the PTPBC has already received information on will not fix the flooding problem. I continue to object to FAQ answers 27 and 29 as being contradictory, given that the ramp is part of the development project, that cost should be provided to the public. I continue to object to FAQ answers 30 as intentionally vague and misleading and intended to justify commercializing a non-commercial town park. And that's all.
Thank you for that, and thank you to the writer of that. Appreciate the contribution to the discussion. So, okay, so if no other public comment, moving on to the next item on our agenda, it's new business.
Martha's raised her hand.
Yes, please, Martha.
I have a question. You know, I'm delighted to hear that so far DEEP is amenable to our raising the parking lot up to 30 inches. But I'm thinking that it is premature to go for a COP at this point, given that the committee is paused for a year. Even when it goes back to working, I believe, and now Frank can help me out on this, but the building committee, I would assume, will be going to the Board of Finance for the total cost of the project. You know, we have, you don't want to, there are no estimates, there's no ballpark estimate even of what raising the parking lot will cost. You know, I think we've got an indication that it's okay. And so when the project resumes, it makes sense to me, you know, to move along and then present everything en masse to the DEEP and be ready to present the total cost to the Board of Finance for approval. I just think it's premature to have them do this, and we don't really know how the final project is going to fall out. That's my comment. I mean, and I went back to the meeting that Jamie had with the Park and Rec Commission in November, and she clearly said that they should revisit a number of areas in the charge, including whether to build new or rehabilitate or have some combination of both. She supported the idea, fortunately, to hire a coastal engineer. She said that there should be a discussion of how a lower level facility could be used. She pointed out that the Norotan Yacht Club, their lower level, they're in a different flood zone, so it can be differently than a lower level that would be used in the Pear Tree area. She said they might want to add dining decks to the charge, and she felt that the concession stand should be defined. So I think there's a lot of work to be done on the part of the commission to reevaluate and perhaps somewhat change the charge. And so I think, you know, again, I think it's great that DEEP says, you know, we can elevate the parking lot, because I think that's very important. But I don't see why we should forge ahead with getting a COP, especially, you know, because you have time limits on it. And we don't really know the nature of the entire project. And I would include that also as what would be the cost. I have no idea on, you know, changing the boat ramp. I mean, I'm hopeful that it's reasonable, but if it's unreasonable, you know, maybe we don't want to do it. People have survived so far. Anyway, that's my comment.
Okay, and you've asked for Frank's comment, so maybe I'll defer to you, Frank, initially, and then I'll share my thoughts. Frank, please.
Well, I was just going to say, I'm not exactly sure the answer, Martha. It is true, obviously, we've already incurred costs here.
Right.
Without having an overall scheme or plan. And that's certainly true in other areas of town activity, that costs are incurred to get ready for something that may or may not be approved. So anyway, that's my.
Well, I'm not worrying about the cost, because it sounds like it's only the estimate. It's about $10,000. I'm worrying about going to DEEP and getting approval and a COP but then we get ourselves potentially into a timing bind. And if we're going to deep with a project that's not really complete yet. And so
Yeah,
I
Martha,
would probably have to go to them again for, whatever we're doing with the bathhouse or whatnot. So I'm just wondering, why forge ahead at this point? It's good news that we can raise the parking lot, and that's a known that the building committee will know in the future.
Yeah, I'm a little confused, honestly. So let me see if you can help me. So first off, one of the very first things that I did when the committee started off, in fact, it was the very first thing I did, is I put together a flow chart, which I shared with the committee, which reflected all the different approval steps that would be required as we progress through the project. And on that was, I believe, fairly certain that on that was deep. And so we knew that we would have a whole series of approval gates that we'd have to progress through, but progressing through one after another doesn't necessarily mean that gets it across the goal line. So going to deep and asking for the COP, in my mind, is one approval step, not unlike going to ZBA or going to planning and zoning in town or going to going to the RTM. So that's the first thing, and that's been known right from the outset. And when I presented that to the team, I don't recall anybody raising any suggestions or preconditions as to whether we should do one thing versus another at the time. So that's the first thing. The second thing is we all voted as a committee back in March unanimously to authorize the design team to go to deep. So I don't know of anything that has changed or that should stand to change that vote that we all kind of unanimously acknowledged. The only thing that, in my mind, potentially that I saw potentially affecting the vote of the committee was Jamie's letter, and with that, recognizing that, I took it upon myself to go back to Jamie and ask her, we voted, we've been moving down this path. This is a multi-dimensional project. The parking lot is one of the dimensions. The boat ramp is one of the dimensions. The buildings are one of the dimensions. The landscaping is one of the dimensions. And so, but recognizing we received your letter, what would you like us to do? And Pam, you can confirm this, but Jamie's indication was, please go forward and secure the COP if that's doable. That's another point. An additional point here is we can't know what a cost for doing any work on the parking lot possibly could be until we know what we'll be approved for. So we can go through a very lengthy exercise of guessing based upon storm drains and stormwater management and elevations, but until DEEP says this is what you're allowed to do, just like until planning and zoning says this is what you're allowed to do, we won't know. So there's no point in discussing costs until we have that information. So look, I appreciate your point. I'm not sure why you're making the point, and I simply don't agree. Let me just finish my point. I don't really agree with the logic of it. I appreciate it, I respect it, I just don't see the logic of it. Because what we're really working towards here is, as we've been doing since the outset, is learning, gathering information, securing approvals from those individual, those organizations and bodies that really are in a position to determine whether or not what we're asking for is appropriate. And it just goes towards one additional bit of information that I think the town benefits from ultimately when if the project is restarted. So I'm simply, I don't understand it. And based upon all of the reasons I just gave you, I can't agree with what you're saying. I don't agree with it.
Okay, I'm only going to make one last comment. Irregardless of cost, I just think from a timing standpoint, okay, it's going to take 3 weeks, 4 weeks for them to submit, and then it takes a month or two, possibly a little more, for DEEP to get back. But then you get your COP and this clock starts ticking. We're closed down for a year, and we're not going to the building committee on day one is not going to suddenly say, be ready to go to the Board of Finance, or maybe they will. Maybe a cost will be developed in the interim. I don't know, but are we going to be ready? I just feel like we're running the clock when we know we can't do anything. And
Well,
why
I
do
think
that? Why put yourself into a time squeeze?
Yeah, so I think the way you're characterizing it, I don't understand it that way. So I'll explain the way I understand it. So first off, what we've learned is we potentially could have a COP that's valid for up to 3 years. Now, there's a possibility that COP may be valid for even more than 3 years. Who knows? But the indication is it's valid for at least 3 years. The other thing is, all of that work has been done. And I would imagine if we had to go back to DEEP 3 years and 1 day from now, because the clock has expired, and ask them for an extension, I can only imagine we'd be in a much better position when we present the package to DEEP, having that package include the COP they previously given us to get a new COP. I mean, I'm sorry, but I mean, that just simply makes sense to me. So as opposed to starting a process whenever we do from the beginning, I don't see why we would want to forego the work that's been done here by Weston Sampson, Redness and Mead, Race, at the risk of, I'm not sure. I'm trying to understand the logic, but if the concern is like a clock ticking, I don't feel that that's a concern at all. I think we've been given an indication that isn't a concern, that shouldn't be a concern.
I think even if the clock does tick here, I mean, the right way to think of this is we're acquiring an option on being able to do the parking lot, and that option may not be available in the future. So it's not like we can put this aside and count on acquiring the opportunity in 2 or 3 years. There'll be different people at DEEP, so to me, it's a valuable thing to get this in place for now.
Randy, unmute yourself.
Yeah, and kind of agree with Frank. I was initially, until I saw Jamie's comments, thinking that we should probably stop at this phase, but given her support, I believe that we have an opportunity with a foot in the door to DEEP, that we should proceed with the COP. And given this whole pandemic thing, I think 3 years may likely easily, slip out, but we'll have it done. And it doesn't affects the boat ramp. It probably doesn't affect the bathhouse structure, whatever we do there in the future. But this part of it and the option, as Frank says, we should find out whether that's going to be on the table for the future. I think it's important for the town, and our charge was to preserve the beach, and this is a major step. That's how I feel on it.
Mr. Chairman, as we've already discussed this matter. Can we move on? We don't need to vote or do anything. We've already voted to move on. Move forward.
Yeah, no, I think, respecting Martha's, perspective on it. Martha, any further thoughts or you'd like to share?
No.
Okay, I appreciate that. Okay, so I'd like to propose I have some items for new business, but before I get to that, I'll just open the floor and ask if anybody else has anything they'd like to contribute under new business. Okay, so with that, I circulated earlier today a brief recap that I prepared, and I think as we're kind of shutting things down here, I think it would be helpful just to have something that kind of summarizes, I think, to some extent briefly what we've done here and some thoughts. And I would just ask if anybody would like to add anything to this after I've gone through it, and I'm going to just briefly run through this now. You could send me your comments. You can add anything to it if you'd like. I will ask Pam to post this on the website also following this meeting. So as I said, I'll just do a quick run through here, and won't read it word for word, but I'll just try to paraphrase it. So basically, as I said, this is a recap with some observations as well. So essentially, the building committee was formed back in October of 2018. Since the formation of the building committee has held 29 meetings. We've made 3 separate presentations to the Parks and Recs Commission, and the presentations that I'm referring to here are presentations made by Neil Houck and Dan. So the architectural presentations and presentations on the site improvement plans, and had positive feedback from the Parks and Rec Commission on that, on those presentations. We actually, in fact, held one joint Parks and Recs Commission and committee meeting, and that was at a point at which there was a fair amount of conversation around the what versus how. And at that meeting, back in the middle of last year, the commission reaffirmed its initial votes, an initial direction that was given to the committee that was kind of memorialized in the charge. One of the very first things that we were asked to do as a committee was to select a design firm. We released an RFP out to the market roughly in November of 2018, a couple of weeks after the formation of the building committee. We solicited responses from design firms. I meant to go back today and look at the precise number. It was certainly at least five responses that we've gotten back. It may have been 7. Some of those were just really not applicable. We worked that down to 3 and went through an interview process in January of the 3 firms that we thought were the most appropriate. We actually made a selection of a firm and through that process, and very soon thereafter learned that what we believed would be delivered by that firm was not going to be the case. So we reopened the process, and in reopening the process, we then selected Neil Houck, the team of Neil Houck Architects and Weston and Sampson. We started with a budget of $150,000. Out of that budget, we spent roughly, Pam, correct me if I'm wrong here, roughly $5,000 in producing a revision to what was kind of an older, certainly obsolete survey of the Pear Tree Beach Point property. And then with the remaining dollars of $144,000, actually with the remaining dollars, essentially kind of aligned with the bid that had come in from the design team. To date, we've spent just a little over $100,000, and we've been at it for since, as I said, at least with the design team, the spring of 2019, and I think we're anticipating, based upon the input that we've gotten from Dan, probably another $10,000 to $12,000 of spend to nail down the COP process. In terms of the work that the design team has done for us, and I'm referring to Neil Houck and Weston Sampson, I think it's quite extraordinary, and I'll just try to go through some high points. So first off, the team attended roughly 13 meetings with the building committee, and also participated in the 3 presentations to the Parks and Recs Commission that I'd mentioned. Those of us who were involved early on in the process will recall that when we put the RFP together, we requested 2 design schemes, 2 design schematics, one of which would potentially be a renovation scheme. In fact, what Neil's team produced for us were roughly 8 different variations of design schemes, some fairly significantly different from others. And each of those ultimately were FEMA compliant, or certainly we ended up with the design schemes that were FEMA compliant. They also delivered a design scheme for a renovation of the building, as well as variations of renovations of the bathhouse that were incorporated into the new building design. Once again, I'll just remind folks, the RFP did not call for freestanding models to be produced. So those are the models beautiful models that were made out of balsa wood that that we actually had in both the town hall and in the library for many months. But having said that, Neil's team felt that it would be beneficial to the work that the committee was doing and to the town to actually have the benefit of freestanding models. So they took it upon themselves, of course, with our kind of, welcoming that, to produce two models. The first model, which was a smaller model of the existing buildings, kind of juxtaposed on the site, took roughly 32 hours to prepare, and the second model was 57 hours. And I'll just remind folks as I'm going through this, the design team's work that they're doing for us was under a fixed price. So all the things that I'm referring to here that were done outside what was originally contracted for, there were no additional charges to the town, no additional cost, and no request for additional cost that was made by the design team. There were a series of construction estimates, initial construction estimates that were prepared by the design team. The first was for the FEMA compliant elevated buildings. And then, of course, for the renovation estimates that were prepared. In fact, for the renovation estimates, Neil actually went out and consulted with a contractor to kind of build, kind of have that be as accurate as possible as an initial round of estimates. And also, the team prepared initial estimates around the site elements, and that was excluding and launching into the discussion around the raising of the parking lot. And then as we rolled along here and we understood kind of better understood the complexity of what we were kind of suggesting and kind of getting ourselves into in terms of the coastal elements, and kind of the interaction with, the coastal aspects of this. The team was supplemented by experts from both redness and mean and race, and that expertise was greatly welcomed, and certainly by the design team as well as me personally. I thought they did a great job in terms of their contribution. And then, as Dan presented to us this evening, the design team progressed into what I consider to be a fairly complex and very thoroughly analyzed plan for elevating the parking lot, which at this stage we've gotten certainly an initial indication from DEEP that they would be approving that. And that was based also upon research that was prepared based upon information provided by NOAA and Yukon Circa. Moving on to conversations with FEMA, and as we learned, fairly early on, there were, FEMA played a very important role in what we were doing here, given kind of the location of the buildings that we were talking about. So we had to come up to speed on FEMA requirements and regulations. There were a whole series of, discussions that took place with FEMA. There were numerous email exchanges with FEMA representatives. There was at least one in-person meeting. We got the contribution of Jeremy Ginsberg and his staff in those conversations with FEMA, and ultimately FEMA granted us approval on the plan for the elevated building that was presented. Similarly with DEEP, as we just talked about, there was an in-person meeting. A number of us went up to Hartford and we sat with the representative from DEEP. A number of email exchanges, and then ultimately, as we discussed this evening, an initial indication that they were approving our plan. As I mentioned early on, so we were working with, so we knew we'd be working with accurate information on the site. We redeveloped the plot plan, the survey for the site. In terms of upcoming activities that are now on hold, and I guess, whenever this is picked up and who's ever involved in it would make a determination of how to proceed through these things. But certainly things that I was hopeful that we'd be able to get to fairly soon and was looking forward to would be the public information sessions, where we'd have an opportunity to really inform the larger population of the community in terms of what we were doing, and really get the larger community to weigh in as to whether or not there was support for this or not. Of course, we talked often about the parking lot analysis, and kind of getting more detail around that, so we would understand the implication of what we were doing with parking spaces and the counts there. We do have, as we talked about earlier on, kind of the introduction of the discussion with the Darien PD and the Marine Division. And I think where that stands is, as I mentioned earlier now, I think that's for the Parks and Recs Commission to determine how it wants to pick up and proceed with Darien PD, and then ultimately make a determination whether or not the charge needs to be supplemented with that. And then all the various other approval gates, one of which was DEEP, as I mentioned, as well as one of which was FEMA, which we've already gone through. And those included things like the Zoning Board of Appeals, the Architectural Review Board. We had an initial informal visit with the Architectural Review Board. We got some feedback from that, Planning and Zoning. And then ultimately going back to the Commission, the Board of Finance, Board of Selectmen, and ultimately culminating with the presentation and approval by representative town meeting. I would say also, in terms of other items, an observation of mine certainly was that, and we all understand this, in terms of the community response and correspondence, no question, a large number of correspondence and emails were received from members of the public. And at our regular committee meetings, they were very, very well attended by members of the public. And the fact of the matter is, at this stage, both the correspondence and the public comment during the meetings were, I would characterize it as overwhelmingly opposed to the new FEMA compliant elevated concession building and the concept of a flexible community space. And finally, a couple of observations. First, I would say, unlike I think what we initially thought we were kind of getting into with the building committee, for those of us who were kind of there from the outset, and speaking from my own personal perspective, kind of observing what happened with the DPW garage building committee, and I think what we now see happening with the Oxford School building committee. A significant amount of time and energy in this building committee was focused on the what as opposed to the hows. And that was not intended to be the charter, I believe. And I don't think it was intended to be the purpose of building committees. That's for future folks to kind of contemplate. But from my perspective, I can simply say it wasn't what I thought we were doing when we were started, when things got kicked off by Jamie back in October of 2018. And I could say there was a dramatic and a profound level of energy and attention that went into the what conversation. So I make that observation for whoever is in the seat of kind of chartering the next set of building committees. But from my perspective, I think it was a very unproductive aspect of what we went through here. I would also say, as I kind of pointed out earlier, and Tom, I appreciate your kind of forbearance on this. I would recommend that any and all future project-related costs presented in certainly this building committee, if it is in fact ever reformed, are presented along with an understanding of the associated cost per household per year. I think there's whatever it is, 6,800 households in Darien. There are various different ways of funding projects like this from a municipal perspective. I'm not an expert on that at all. I would never attempt to kind of throw a number out there in terms of what that might look like. But I would strongly urge the Board of Finance, working along with building committees, when numbers are put out there for kind of contemplation by the community. I think it's important, as it would be important in my own personal perspective, to understand what the personal cost to me and my family will be as a taxpayer in the town. So those are my observations, and I think those are just a brief synopsis of what I think we as a building committee accomplished. I have the financial summary here. You guys have it. We just went through it briefly. I guess the only other thing that I would like to simply say is to the thank yous at this point. And it's been a privilege from my perspective for me to be involved in this exercise. I want to first thank Randy. My co-chair has just been a wonderful collaborator throughout this entire process. Past and present committee members, the public, I'm appreciative. I mean, largely, the comment and the input that I personally got from, in large part from the public, was in opposition to what we were doing here. I'm appreciative of just how diligent the opposition was in sticking to communicating their thoughts on this, because I think what it did is it forced me to just redouble my efforts to be as diligent as I personally possibly could have been in the exercise. I want to thank Jamie. I want to thank the town staff that was involved in this, including folks like Jeremy, Jeremy's team, Tony Hamicki, Pete Solheim, and of course you, Pam. And of course, the consultants, the design team of Neil, Brian, Rob Meltzer, the kind of the unsung hero of the design team who actually produced these beautiful models, and the extension of the design team with Craig and Devin. So I apologize for the valedictorian kind of comments here, but a lot of work's gone into this on everybody's part, and it's. I hope the town, when the opportunity arises, we'll take another serious look at this. I don't know what the outcome of this will be. I don't know what the final kind of disposition of this will be, but I think a lot of good hard work's been done. That's of real value to the community in terms of understanding how to truly preserve this wonderful amenity for the town of Darien, which I know we all love, all of us deeply. So in any case, I apologize. I appreciate you guys putting up with my my comments here, my stream of consciousness comments. And with that, I'll just open it up to the committee members for any other comments before we adjourn. So please, if anybody has anything they'd like to add, don't be shy.
I'd like to add, thank you to everybody as well. It was a really a great project to work on. It was a lot to learn and navigate. And, I think I really appreciate all of your input and all of your help with this project. And everyone should know that it was all, everything we did was for the community. It was for the better of the community and preserving the area and making an improvement that everyone could enjoy for many years to come. So let's get through this pandemic and hope we can all join hands again.
So, Krista, are we, the Board of Selectmen just asked us to be on hold. They didn't disband this committee, correct?
That's correct, Cheryl. The Board of Selectmen has not opined, discussed the status of the Pear Tree Point Building Committee to date. I think Jamie and the board, working with the Board of Finance, is obviously very concerned about the financial status of the town, and Board of Finance is working with both boards, and this is, largely obviously the impetus for this discussion. By no means is it the merit of the project, it's just the financial situation in which we're in. Though I must admit, when I heard about those prices of the parking lots going in half, I got a little excited there, Frank, but we have to be respectful of where the community is from a financial perspective. But to be specific, Cheryl, no, the Board of Selectmen has not voted in any way on the status of this committee.
Thank you. I just want to say, as everybody knows, I'm down there all the time, but I was so disappointed when this happened from the Board of Selectmen and Jamie's letter. My heart sunk. But in this situation, she did the right thing. The Board of Selectmen did the right thing. And I think we need to really sit back and take a good hard look at this while we all think for the next year anyway, of how we can get something done down there and make it palatable for the community, because we are in a really financial situation right now. I mean, there's so many people out of work and so many people hurting. And I just came back from Florida, and the people in line for food, it's heartbreaking that people never had to be in a line before to get a handout for food. And here in Darien, we're a little bit better off, I think, but there's still a lot of people that are hurting. And I think that the selectmen did the right thing, and I'm happy to have been on this committee. I'm happy to move forward in a year from now with this whole committee. I think we've all gotten along very well. I think we've all worked together very well. And I hope someday we can see a beautiful parking lot, beach extension, no flooding, and bathhouses and concession stand of some sort. And I really thank you all for working with me and putting up with me, and let's hope that we can move forward again in a year.
I just want to thank Mike for taking over the burden of a lot of these administrative agendas, notes, and stuff like that I just found while still working, I just have not had the time. He's really, I think we all owe him a vote of thanks for doing as much work as he's done on this, and it certainly made my life a lot easier. So we'll see what happens in a year.
By the way, I apologize. I did leave off one very important thank you, and that is to our secretary, who is the other unsung hero, the more important unsung hero here, who's kind of kept us honest by reminding us what we've actually chatted about from, since for the last couple of years. So Tom, thank you very, very much, and much appreciated. That's really a thankless job, but thank you very much for it.
As Cheryl said, I enjoyed working with everybody here. And to that end, I would like to make a motion to adjourn.
Do we have a second?
I'll second.
Yeah.
Okay, so
That's
now we're
Adele.
gonna have to do a roll call here. So all those in favor, Frank,
Yep.
Martha,
Yes.
Cheryl,
Yes.
Randy,
Yes.
Krista,
Yes.
and yes from me. So with that, thank you all. Thank you very much. The meeting is adjourned.